Okay, well, thanks so much to Ben for joining us. I grew up with Ben in a suburb directly west of Minneapolis called St. Louis Park, and he and I actually worked on a high school newspaper together, and I'm so happy that we've been able to stay connected through social media, and that's partly how I know about his project and this work he's been doing. So he's a speaker, filmmaker, and a writer. He lives in Brooklyn. And last year, he was the keynote speaker at the National Security Agency's annual Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony. And he continues to present his family story to students, professionals, and community organizations everywhere. And his grandmother lives in Minneapolis, and she was the 2019 recipient of the FBI Director's Community Leadership Award. I'm going to let him go into her story, but it's remarkable. Survival from concentration camps and World War II. And so you may have seen a photo of her if you've traveled through the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. It's hung prominently there. And you may remember her name because she spoke at an event in Montana in the 90s in Billings after several attacks were directed at the Jewish community there. So Ben, we'd love to have you take it away.
Thanks so much. Let me get my screen sharing started here. Oh, I need the host to enable my screen sharing. And we'll get started.
Should be good.
There we go. Okay, 1 second. Great. Yeah, I appreciate the introduction, Maritza and Jim, for inviting me to join all of you this morning in Montana. I wish I could be there in person. I understand the skies are gray, and they are here too, so I'll just have to postpone that trip. As Maritza mentioned, my name is Ben Cohen, and I'll just tell you a little bit more about myself. I grew up in St. Louis Park with Maritza. That's a suburb in Minnesota, outside of Minneapolis, and I'm a filmmaker. And I'm joining you today from New York, where I live with my dog, Ham. And Maritza, I can see on the side, if you can just give me a thumbs up that you see Ham, then I know my screen's working. Okay, good. So I'm the grandson of a Holocaust survivor named Judy Meisel. And my relationship with my grandmother is in many ways probably just like everyone else. She tells me how proud she is of me, she bakes me cookies, and she loves it when I call her, even if I have nothing important to tell her. And I call her Safta. Safta survived the Holocaust and was 16 years old when the war ended. More than 140 members of our family were killed at the hands of Nazis. And her story is in my DNA. It's a story she has shared countless times, and I'm honored to share it with you all today. But to start us off, I'd like to pose a question for everyone to think about. Who was responsible? Who do you think was responsible for the Holocaust? I'd like you to think about this as I tell you my family's story of survival. It's a story about hope, about late justice, and the power that each one of us has to make a difference in the world. Just over a year ago, I walked into the juvenile courtroom in Germany. It was the opening day of the trial of Dr. Johann Rebogen. Now, 75 years ago, in 1944, Rebogen was a Nazi guard at a place called Stutthof concentration camp. And on that day, the former Nazi faced charges of accessory to mass murder. My grandmother, Mina Becker, was murdered in the gas chamber at Stutthof. Now I'm going to show you a video clip from the trial. When I first saw Rebogen enter the courtroom, my hands shook, my heart stopped. The courtroom fell absolutely silent, except for rapid-fire clicks coming from cameras. His trial had captured the attention of news media around the world. It might be the last Nazi trial. Now, I had gone to Germany to observe the proceedings on behalf of my family. And from a very young age, I was told a story by my grandmother. My safta, which is the Hebrew word for grandmother, would join us today to tell you this story herself, but she's 91 years old and it's too difficult. We are fortunate, however, that she was so committed in her lifetime to speaking and giving her testimony that we know what happened. And I humbly will share her story with you, the story I have known my entire life, and the reason that I found myself face to face with this Nazi guard. Safta was born in Lithuania on February 7th, 1929, in a small town known as Justvina. Safta's father, my great-grandfather, Osterbecker, worked in the lumber trade. Safta's mother, Mina, was, as my Safta has described her, a liberated woman in her time. Mina believed that the young girls should be educated as much as the boys, and Safta looked up to her two older siblings, Rachel and Abe. In 1938, when Safta was 8 years old, her father passed away. Mina and the children moved to the city of Kovno, which is today called Kaunas, and my great-grandmother took up work as a seamstress to support the family. In the summer of 1940, Soviet Russia occupied Lithuania. Now, life changed under Soviet rule. Our family could no longer attend synagogue, light candles, or observe Shabbat in public. It became a dangerous place to practice Jewish traditions for fear of violence. Mina warned her children to carefully conceal their Jewish identities in public. At the time, anti-Semitism was at a fever pitch throughout Europe. Nazi Germany had begun invading neighboring countries. Safta recalls hearing rumors that they are burning the Jews in Poland. As a young child, just 11 years old, Safta was told not to ask too many questions. How could anyone even explain all of this to an 11-year-old child? The next summer in 1941, Hitler's army invaded Lithuania. And over the next 4 years of Safta's life, she endured one harrowing episode after another. For 3 years, she and her family were forced to live in the Kovno ghetto. About 29,000 Jews were confined to the Kovno ghetto. Within the first 3 months, 12,000 had been murdered there. Many others died from starvation. My family was forced into slave labor, working in a factory, making rubber boots, and building an airport for the German army. Because Safta had blonde hair and blue eyes, she was selected and trained to sneak out of the ghetto to find bread and supplies. Her brother Abe also took part in these dangerous but important missions, risking everything to help others. They were at constant threat of being caught, and punishment would have meant certain death. They had many close calls. Safta was only 12 years old. By this time, the final solution, a term for the Nazis' systematic annihilation of Jews, was in full swing. By June of 1944, the Nazis began deporting Jews from Kovno to camps throughout Nazi-occupied territories in Germany. Safta, Rachel, and Mina were helpless as their brother Abe was sent to Dachau concentration camp, and the women were deported to Stutthof. Now I'll pause just for a moment and point out there really is no substitute for hearing this story firsthand. Nothing is as powerful as an eyewitness testimony. As I mentioned to you, Safta has shared her story countless times. If I were to guess, and I'm not trying to exaggerate, in her lifetime, she may have told this story to more than hundreds of thousands of people. One classroom, one auditorium, one interview, one willing listener at a time. She even came to Montana in the 1990s, as Maritza mentioned. Also in the 1990s, Safta returned to Stutthof twice, and each time a camera crew accompanied her. Because she shared this testimony with so much conviction, we have the ability now to hear from her in her own words and go back with her to Stutthof concentration camp.
When we got to Stutthof, the men got off, and they separate them from us. We went into Stutthof, and all I saw was this huge mountains of shoes. And I said to my mother, what are all the shoes doing? There were shoes, there were combs, there were piles of things. And she said, why do you ask me questions all the time? I don't know. We had to get into one line. And they told everybody to get undressed, and they gave you a striped dress, 2 clogs. My sister to this day says, you were lucky you got a left and a right. I had 2 right clogs, and you had to wear it all the time. My mother had gold teeth. I think 3 gold teeth. And they just yanked it out, and my mother's whole face was full of blood. I had long blonde hair. They cut my hair a little bit. And then the Gestapo lady was on one side, and the Gestapo guy was on the other side, and they both had fun, and they tore my hair out. And when I got in, again, my poor mother, there was blood all over. Her face was full of blood, mine was full of that.
In April of 2017, Safta found an unlikely audience. The FBI contacted my family and informed us that investigators from Germany were seeking information about Stutthof. We were shocked at the news. German prosecutors were seeking Safta's eyewitness testimony about her time in the camp. They were pursuing an indictment of several guards still alive and living free in Germany. I flew home to Minneapolis to be with Safta when the investigators came to her apartment in St. Louis Park to interview her. Safta can still remember a lot, but to everyone's surprise, she even recognized a photo of Rebogen in his Nazi uniform. After she answered 4 hours of questions, the investigators had the information they came for. They packed up their things and went back to Germany. A few months later, we received a copy of the charges against Rebogen, which included Safta's testimony. Then we waited an entire year for a trial. With any crime, investigators need to understand the crime scene. So let me talk a little bit more about Stutthof. When Safta, Rachel, and Mina arrived at Stutthof, she recalls a female guard whipped the arriving prisoners and shouted, "You'll never get out of here alive. You're all to be doomed." In the eyes of the guards, we were not human. The incoming prisoners were beaten, terrorized, and the women were assigned to barracks where they would sleep sometimes 4 or 5 to a bed. Every day they were made to stand for hours. They were forced into slave labor again. Meals, if you can call it that, consisted of a soup, usually made from potato peels and sawdust. Bread was scarcely given, and there was never enough. As described in great detail in the indictment of the guard, the SS had carefully designed a program in which the slave labor, combined with malnutrition, was a perfect method to get a little bit of work out of the prisoners for the German war effort until they were too weak to go on. Stutthof, as many have called it, was a mini Auschwitz. The indictment described other killing methods and the total brutality of the camp. Disease was rampant. Bodies piled higher every day. In winter, prisoners were forced to stand outside until they would freeze to death. A training manual for the guards illustrates they were under direct order to shoot anyone who was believed to try to escape. And then there was the gas chamber, this small red brick building at the rear of the camp. 75 years ago, my great-grandmother Mina was selected for the gas chamber. She didn't know what she had been selected for. It could have been a day of work at the factory. Safta did not want to be separated from her mother and soon found herself with Mina in line at the gas chamber.
They took her. They took her with like 20 other women. And I clung to her and I said, I want to go with you. And she said, no. And I said, yes. And we went into the gas chamber and were told to get undressed. The guard looked at me and he said, laughing, and I know he was drunk. Because the way he was saying, he said, no, I should run. And he said, ain't sway dry, you know. He started counting, and my mother starts saying, Leif Judith, run, run. And I run.
So you ran out of the gas chamber. Will walking into that place again for the first time be the hardest thing you've done in a long time?
Yeah.
What makes you want to go back to that place?
To show the world.
She shares her pain to show us what happens when bigotry and racism go unchallenged. For Judy's son, Michael, it is a lesson which gives meaning to his grandmother's death.
That no one should be indifferent to cruelty, that we all have a collective responsibility to be good to other people, no matter who they are, what they believe in. And perhaps because of what happened to her, somebody or some people will be touched and will not let that happen again.
It was the last time Judy saw her mother. She went and found Rachel and told her, "We don't have a mother anymore." A few months passed, and in the dead of winter, Safta and Rachel escaped Stutthof. The SS rounded up all the prisoners and planned to march them to their death in the Baltic Sea. But during this death march, a bombing raid by the Russian army provided enough chaos and cover for the girls to escape. They spent the next 5 months on the run. They crossed a frozen river and found refuge in a convent. The nuns wanted them to convert to Catholicism and actually said if they didn't, they would have to turn them over to the authorities. So they decided to leave, determined to survive as Jews. They found shelter with a family running a stopover station for Nazi soldiers. It was no picnic. They were again beaten and tortured as slaves. It was so terrible they sometimes wished they were back in the camp where their own mother had been murdered. As the German army began to lose control of the area, the family had to flee and brought Safta and Rachel with them on a boat headed to Denmark. The boat was torpedoed and sank, but again, Safta and Rachel managed to survive. They lived in a refugee camp in Denmark until they were finally liberated on May 5th, 1945.
They said, anyone that is not German should come forward. And my sister and I, we stood up, and I said to my sister, I'm afraid to tell them we're Jewish. What if it's a hoax? What's going to happen? They'll find out, they'll kill us. And she said, no, we have to do that. The war is over. So we walked up to the Red Cross lady, and we told the woman that we were Jews. The woman stood up, and she almost cried. And she said to prove that we're Jewish. And we signed our name in Hebrew. She gave us a big hug, and she said, do you know where you are? And we said, we know we're not in Germany. When they weighed me, it was 47 pounds, and I was 16 years old. they gave me a flowered kerchief, and I never took off that scarf. I wore it all the time. Rachel and I thought still that we were the only Jews. So we were curious, are there any other Jews? And there were none. A woman said, in a couple of weeks, the Jews will come back. And I remember my sister saying, how do you know there are Jews left? And she said, we know, we helped them across to Sweden.
The girls were rehabilitated in Denmark, and they learned that Abe had survived Dachau. They reunited with their brother in Canada, and Safta eventually settled down in Philadelphia, where she married my grandfather and started a family of her own. Her first child, she named Minna, then my father Michael, and my aunt Debbie. Safta found freedom in America, but when she saw the prevalence of racism within her own community, she could not sit idly by. She was not a little girl anymore, and she began taking action in the civil rights movement. She committed her lifetime to share this story as a warning against intolerance and hate.
I was having dinner and listening to the news. An African-American family by the name of Bakers moved in to an all-white neighborhood called Folkloft. And a mob of people turned out, taunting them, screaming, yelling at them, throwing all kinds of debris. And I was devastated because here I was in Philadelphia, in the city of brotherly love, and it was like Kristallnacht in 1938 on November 9th, when the world sat and looked what was happening in Germany, and nobody did anything about it. So I baked some cookies, and I went to the bakers. I was called white trash, you name it, everything as I was walking by. But I felt that if their homes were not safe, my home were not safe. And their rights are trampled on, my Jewish rights are trampled on at the same time. I was a Holocaust survivor, but I could not talk about it. I did not want to traumatize my children. But that incident with the bakers, it made an incredible mark on me.
When her grandchildren were born and we reached the age that she was during the war, she made sure that we too understood what had happened and taught us that every person has an ability and responsibility to make a positive difference. She would often start her teachings by asking, "Who do you think was responsible for what happened?" And students often answered, "Hitler." She would respond with, "The whole world was responsible." Now, although Safta's story has been part of my family's DNA for generations, we never discussed or considered that a guard from Stutthof could be made to answer for his role in what happened after all this time. As a witness and survivor, Safta had the option to go to the trial and give her testimony in person in Germany. And if they had pursued the trial sooner, Safta would have stood in that courtroom, looked Ribogen in the eye, and given her testimony in person. But by the time the trial opened, at the advisement of her doctors, her attorney, and our family, Safta agreed it just was not possible to make that trip overseas. For health reasons, it was too difficult and too risky. But someone from our family should be there, so I decided to go. And on the first day of the trial, it began with the prosecutor from Dortmund presenting charges: accessory to mass murder. These trials have been few and far between, leaving most of the perpetrators of the Holocaust to live freely after the war. However, over the past 20 years, a new precedent was set in Germany's courts that opened the door for prosecutions of concentration camp guards for accessory to murder, and Germany is now making a late pursuit for justice. On the first day of the trial, the charges were read, and I watched in astonishment as my safta's attorney stood, faced Rebogan in the courtroom. With the full weight of my family's suffering on his shoulders, he read a statement from Judy. In her words, the guard listened to the story of the ghetto, the camp, the day she watched as her mother was forced into the gas chamber. She does not wish for revenge, only the truth. The statement ended with this: it may be that the defendant did not choose to become a guard in Stutthof, but he must face the responsibility for what he did when he was in Stutthof. He was responsible for helping with these unimaginable crimes against humanity, for helping to murder my beloved mother, whom I have missed so much my entire life. Prosecutors point out that the first and most important reason they pursue these trials so many years later is for the survivors. The survivors have had to live with this trauma their entire lives, and we owe it to them to pursue this justice as long as we can. The discomfort of the old men on trial is nothing compared to the discomfort that the survivors have lived with every day. Hearing Safta's statement read in German to the courtroom and to see the Nazi have to listen to it, I thought no matter how flawed, no matter how late, I was witnessing a historic and honorable pursuit of justice. The courtroom was quiet. Several people around me were weeping. I looked to my right and watched Rebogan as he listened to Safta's words. When the court session adjourned for the day, I left the courtroom and immediately I was hounded by members of the press. One of them told me I was the only family member of any survivor to be there. I was the closest they could get to speaking to a survivor. In the barracks at Stutthof, the other prisoners had made a promise to one another. They promised that if anyone survived, they would tell the story of what happened to them. Safta kept that promise, and now it was my responsibility to do the same, for her, for Rachel, and for Mina. I had come to Germany to observe and document the trial. As a filmmaker, I wanted to capture images and hoped to be able to share this chapter of her story as best as I could. Suddenly, I realized I was not just an observer. And when reporters asked me why I had come there, I told them about that promise that Safta made in the barracks at Stutthof. Now, the magnitude of the Holocaust is unimaginable. We remember the 6 million Jews and the millions of others killed by the Nazis and their collaborators, including non-Jewish Polish civilians, Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, Serbian civilians, persons with disabilities, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, or anyone deemed an enemy to the Nazi party. Studies show that today the younger generations have already started to forget at alarming rates amidst a rise of white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and hate crimes around the globe. A recent study revealed that 2/3 of American millennials don't know what Auschwitz is, and throughout the world, Holocaust denial is on the rise. After hours of interviews, I was exhausted. I returned to my hotel and I called my parents, and then I called Safta. They're doing the best they can for you, I told her. Now, the trial of Rebogan continued for another 2 weeks, and I'll tell you briefly what happened. In the second week of the trial, Rebogan gave a statement of his own. He denied any firsthand knowledge of killing in the camp. Though he acknowledged the conditions for the prisoners were terrible, he also tried to paint himself as a victim, saying he was forced to be there by a draft. According to Rebogan, Stutthof was his own personal hell. During the third week, Rebogan collapsed in court and was rushed out of the courtroom, never to return. A medical exam found he could no longer stand trial, and after waiting a few more months to see if he could recover, the case was thrown out. There will be no official verdict for Johann Rebogan. So we returned to our lives. I went back to New York, and Safta cared for her beautiful orchids in the Twin Cities. We assumed that that was the end. Then last summer, we learned another guard would stand trial this year. I asked Safta how she felt about it. Would she want the chance to participate in another trial? I'm not running away from it, she said, and signed the papers. So I packed my bags, and last fall, I went back to Germany, this time to Hamburg. I was greeted by many familiar faces, the prosecutors, some of them they call Nazi hunters, that I've gotten to know over the past few years. journalists from around the world, several of whom have helped me navigate German history and even translate in the courtroom for me. I was again there in the courtroom when they wheeled a former Stutthof guard in to face charges of accessory to mass murder. Today, Bruno Dai's trial in Hamburg continues despite the pandemic. Bruno Dai is much healthier than Rebogen, and he is much more outspoken. At the opening of that trial, I witnessed the judge question Dai for 2 hours. He says he is sorry for what happened and yet denies any personal responsibility for any killing. He knew of the gas chambers and the plan to exterminate the Jews, and yet he complains that this trial is an interruption to his happy retirement years. Time is not on our side, and in March, the defense asked for the trial to be thrown out due to the coronavirus spread, but the judge committed to keeping the trial alive. We are currently in the final weeks of this trial, and expert witnesses are appearing right now to explain how Nazi concentration camp guards could in fact request to be transferred out of their guard duty without reprisal. Even though Dai is not a mastermind of the Holocaust, he did make choices, and as safta has taught me, we're all responsible for our actions. The judges will deliberate, and a verdict is anticipated in July. So we wait. But frankly, we're more concerned about safta's isolation and health as we all try to overcome this global health crisis. And when that first trial of Rebogen ended last year, my parents took safta to dinner at one of her favorite restaurants. And they asked her, did she feel that the trial had ended? She thought to herself for a moment and then told them she was disappointed, but she also felt like she had achieved something that she had never really imagined was possible. To safta, it was monumental to know that in that courtroom, in the papers and on television in Germany, and even here today, the whole world can learn her story. And she thought about her mother, Mina, what it would be like to tell her that her great-grandson was there to bear witness. Now, in closing, I'll just leave you with a few more thoughts. The truth is, we're about to enter a world very soon where all of the eyewitnesses to the Holocaust will be gone. The survivors, and with them, the perpetrators, too. But evil and hatred will not die with them. The capacity for humans to be ignorant, to be manipulated by greed, by conspiracies and fear will never go away. Read the news today. Even amidst a global pandemic, anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry is on the rise and in full display everywhere. Ignorance is passed from generation to generation, and it's up to each of us to break that chain. Educate yourselves and about other people's histories and about our own systemic problems of inequality. Speak up when you see it. Stand in solidarity with those who are on the fringe, those who are vulnerable or treated as less than. Luckily, just as humans have the capacity for evil, Judy's story shows us that even stronger is our capacity for survival and for hope. Judy would tell you all right now that after listening to her story, you're all witnesses too. And she would urge you to do whatever you can to help her keep that promise she made to make sure that nobody will ever forget. So with that, I really appreciate you all having me as part of your breakfast club today, and I'm happy to stick around to answer some questions. And that's it. Thank you.